But like early dashboard, right? Not the later shit when he plugged in.
No, like the Turpentine Chaser, first album stuff.
If we can talk about anything but Dashboard Confessional,
let's talk about our feelings.
I
want to talk about my feelings.
I want to talk about my feels.
As a 19-year-old listening to Dashboard Confessional.
Confessional.
This needs to go to the podcast.
All right, should we start? I'm Liam Billingham.
I'm George Rogopoulos.
This is Oeuvre Busters. I changed it up. Bonus episode we have a special guest today, Shaun. Hi, Shaun.
Hey, how you guys doing?
Good, how are you?
I'm doing all right.
Day 135 of quarantine, I believe.
Yeah.
Day 4,000.
I mean,
how are you guys holding up?
I'm doing okay. Teaching the kids film in this kind of time, especially film production, is very tricky. But a lot of kids are getting creative and making like home invasion thrillers in their apartment. Ooh. So yeah, they're finding ways of doing it.
That is really, really cool. Speaking of film production, Shaun's our special guest for today, Shaun Seneviratne. George, do you want to read Shaun's bio?
I would be happy to read Shaun's bio if I could find it, actually. Oh, here we go. So Shaun is a Sri Lankan-American filmmaker and educator in Brooklyn, New York. His past work has been screened at festivals such as Nantucket, Montclair, CAAM, and San Diego Asian Film Festival. Currently, Shaun is developing his first feature film, and he teaches film production at Brooklyn STEAM Center, as well as film history and visual storytelling at Pace University.
Currently, Shaun appears to be drinking a golden beverage of some kind.
Yes,
and
it's living his best life in quarantine.
It's a hazy IPA from Evil Twin. It's quite good.
Sounds like a lot of work. You know me and my beer.
Can we quickly say something about a recent film maybe that we've seen during quarantine that we recommend?
Cool. That's a good one. Shaun, go first.
Oh, man. So I've been keeping track every day on Instagram of my social distancing movie marathon. And yesterday I just saw Ball of Fire by Howard Hawks, and Billy Wilder wrote it. Ooh. And it's really, really good. And Barbara Stanwyck is like amazing in it, and it's actually the first Gary Cooper movie I've seen who I really dug. And I was inspired to watch Howard Hawks because this essay that we're about to start talking about got me thinking of like Nicholas Ray and Howard Hawks and like these directors that Farber might consider Termite. So yeah, really good movie. Leaving Criterion Channel this month, so month of April. So
God bless the Criterion Channel. Speaking of the Criterion Channel, this week I watched for the first time The Day Trippers, Greg Matala's
yes, you were
first
saying
feature. I actually watched it, and then I watched it again with the commentary track.
Nice.
Because the commentary track has Greg Matala, the editor Anne McCabe, and Steven Soderbergh, who produced the movie. And Soderbergh commentaries are the best commentaries. Yeah. And then last night I watched the first 45 minutes of the Roger Spottiswoode, Pierce Brosnan starring Tomorrow Never Dies, which is very bad. It's very, very bad. It's very bad. It is unbelievable.
I didn't even want to watch that when I was like 11.
Oh my God, I watched that movie repeatedly when I was 12. George, what about you?
Who's the femme fatale in that one?
It's Terry Hatcher and Michelle Yeoh.
That's right.
Terry Hatcher is somnibulant in the movie. She is terrible.
Great use of the word somnibulant there. Last weekend I watched Edward Yang's A Brighter Summer Day.
Amazing movie.
Amazing fucking movie. It's 4 hours long. I did watch it in about 3 different sittings, but over the span of one day at least. But it does just fly by.
Watch, cry.
It was one of those films where literally at the end of it, the last 15 minutes, when something, of course, catastrophic happens and tragic, I literally was like sitting there on my couch going like, oh no. Like, why would this happen? Why would this happen? But it's an amazing film. It's so novelistic and beautifully shot. It's just brilliant.
Yeah, absolutely. I actually had a day trippers moment when I watched Brighter Summer Day because I watched it one night and then the next day I had to watch it again. Wow. Yeah, it was like a super powerful experience.
It's a beautiful film.
I really appreciate the trolling of me talking about watching a James Bond movie, and then George chimes in with like one of the most ambitious epics.
Well, you talked about
past.
Day Trippers.
Yeah,
that's true. Speaking of ambitious epics, do you know what's available today on Film Society's virtual cinema?
Aquaman.
Satan Tango.
Oh, sweet.
So, guys, get on it. Okay, well, we should just jump right in. So, we brought Shaun on because he's a filmmaker, but also a film whiz, knows a lot more about movies than George and I would say. And we got a question from a listener and a former guest of the show, Michael Carroll. He sent us a message via Twitter where I am Spartacus. And his question was, let me get into the mic voice. Just kidding. While I'm familiar with Manny Farber and the theory of termite art and white elephant art, I'm also a busy man who's never made time to actually read anything by him. Is it basically that some art is lowbrow and some is highbrow, or is there more nuance there? And how does this apply to a pop culture icon like Batman, who's had wild, weird artists like Dick Sprang and Bill Finger, as well as polished Hollywood auteurs like Christopher Nolan and Tim Burton contributing to the mythos? Thank you, Mike, for this question. I think we'll skip over Dick Sprang and Bill Finger for the purposes of the podcast, which is mostly about the films. But
also,
Dick
those
Sprang
are made up
really,
names, by the way.
Yeah, they're not real.
Bill Finger and Dick Sprang.
Hey, Mike, those names are fucking fake. No, Dick Sprang is definitely responsible for the more wacky, wild Batman stuff that definitely influenced the Schumacher movies. And I don't know too much about Bill Finger, but let's talk about the movie stuff. So should we start with the theory of white elephant art versus termite art?
Would be
and the
helpful.
reason we asked Shaun on is because after I saw Blade Runner 2049, Shaun and I believe had a heated exchange about which one was better, and he referred to Blade Runner 2049 as white elephant art and Blade Runner as termite art. I'd be curious if he still thinks that. But Shaun, do you want to tell us a little bit give us a working definition of white elephant art versus termite art?
Yeah. So I've definitely not changed my opinion on Blade Runner 2049 versus the original, but as to its termite qualities, that's sort of evolved a little. But essentially a working definition for the termite art versus the white elephant art. One, everyone should read this essay on their own because it's really interesting and it's super well written. His use of language says so much, and he's got such a great command of what he wants to say that reading his actual words is so much more impactful than however I'm going to summarize this. But
I also think it's a little more complicated than it's like the work itself is a piece of art, so it's open for interpretation. Totally,
yeah. It's when the criticism transcends into its own kind of piece. It's a standalone, right? So with termite art, essentially he kind of defines this as termite art is not having ambition towards some kind of guilt culture or message or any kind of pretension. There tends to be in termite art a focus on individual moments to a near obsessive level, not necessarily considering the whole and how everything fits together. So it's all about what happens at that specific moment in a film, as opposed to this feeling of everything needing to be in strict continuity. He also says it's got a sense of eating away at its own boundaries. So termite art and termites not knowing the frame or the box that it's supposed to exist within. There's no larger agenda, no point you're trying to make, not a grand artistic treatise. It's just you putting in the work. Ultimately, to me, it feels like it's process, not product, and that emphasis on the process being what's most important, and almost feels like an inside-out version of art. So white elephant art is in exact contrast to that. So with the white elephant art, I didn't really know where that term was coming from. Like I know the Hemingway novel Hills Like White Elephant, but with this one over here, or the short story, I was like, all right, what exactly is it? And so I looked it up, and it used to be these auctions, right? And white elephants were these things that were considered expensive, but ultimately totally worthless, or didn't have any use. So White Elephant,
like a film school degree,
like a film school degree. So it speaks to this idea of like knowing that there's a box and a frame and self-awareness of what a good movie is supposed to be or what a movie is supposed to be, or trying to imbue like every single part of it with significance or importance in a way that isn't really about the work necessarily itself, but maybe to Manny Farber feels a bit more self-aggrandizing, more about promotion, more about you making a point and saying something with your art or telling everyone to look at your art in all caps. Sort of focusing a little bit more on that. So to me, it's this, and what he says is this emphasis on aesthetics as opposed to the individual moment, this emphasis on continuity, self-awareness of the work itself to the point where maybe you're trying to say something with the work or instill a message of some kind. So to me, White Elephant art is this idea of like outside in, right? You're working from the outside towards what you're building in the piece. And it tends to be more about the product and not the process.
I feel like if we were to boil that down to like the most simple terms, I feel like White Elephant art has quote unquote good taste and the technique is really apparent. And then Termite art to me is a lot more functional and a little bit more like industrial or whatever that might mean. Like I think of a recent film that I watched that felt like Termite art was the French Connection, and for me it was because it was so lacking in frills and the technique was so direct, and I didn't feel like there's themes. That movie's about things, but it certainly is not trying to be about anything. Its story has themes and ideas in it, but he's certainly not talking about how what the police do is inherently racist and problematic. It's just there in the movie itself. Do you guys, or Shaun, do you have a good example of what you would consider a Termite artist or a Termite film versus a White Elephant film?
Yeah. So, like as I was reading this essay, like I was just trying to rack my brain of like, what is the modern example of what he's talking about? What's interesting is he actually doesn't really talk about any specific Termite filmmakers in his essay, but he does call out, Truffaut and Antonioni as the White Elephant examples that he brings up. Though I think he references John Ford as being like a Termite actor, and I think he references another actor as doing something particularly. John Wayne, being Termite-y. But so to me now, like when I think of Termite art, I think of movies by John Cassavetes, Leo Carrà, Harmony Korine. In the Mood for Love era, or pre In the Mood for Love, Wong Kar-wai, Safdie brothers, and I think Marin Ade, Alex Ross Perry, and PTA and Scorsese are kind of in between Termite and the White Elephant. The White Elephant to me is just like, I always thought of it when I first read this essay as like the lame Oscar bait shit, right? Like any movie that comes out with Eddie Redmayne or Glenn Close in it that like you've never heard of but comes out in January so it could get nominated for an Oscar. But then
HBO.
Yeah, right. I think a lot of prestige television. Yeah. So I was watching some fucking this Stephen King some fucking show. This Stephen King, The Outsider. Holy shit.
Is it
any
good?
Awful. It's so awful. Bad. I just watched one episode. Really? It's so bad. And so I think of stuff like that. I think Ari Aster is the most White Elephant director out right now. I think Jordan Peele, Damien Chazelle are very White Elephant-y. And I actually wouldn't consider Antonioni or Truffaut White Elephant, but especially Truffaut, but I could see Farber's points with it.
I'm looking at the notes that we're sharing here, and there's one name that you skipped over, and I'm curious as to why, and that name is Quentin Tarantino.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, you didn't mention him, and I know, George, you have some thoughts about Quentin Tarantino.
Yeah. That was the one name I skipped.
I feel like he's very White Elephant-y, because I feel like there is a very, very clear... I mean, he's known for making references to pop culture in his previous movies, and I feel like it's only in the past, let's say, 3 to 4 films where I've been like, oh, there's more, the pop culture references are in service to something, whereas in the early movies I was like, oh, this guy just wants to be Ringo Lamb,
right,
or he wants to be Martin Scorsese in some way. But I don't know, I feel like Once Upon a Time in Hollywood is so rich with references, but transcends some of that stuff and really becomes the best part about that movie is Brad Pitt and DiCaprio's characters. I don't know if you guys want to speak to that at all.
George?
Oh, I think there's the interesting, like Tarantino is interesting because it does seem like late Tarantino, if we want to call it that. And who knows how many more Tarantino films are there going to be.
We're getting one more.
I mean, that's what he says. Like Inglourious Bastards also, I think, has touches of like white elephant art as well. I mean, I think what's interesting also about, well, a couple of things, and we could obviously go back and talk about some of the things that have already been raised, but the distinctions, I think how far the goalposts have moved since Farber wrote this essay, I think is really important. Like to think about, let's say, these directors like Antonioni and Truffaut as being white elephant artists at the moment that this essay was being written is interesting. But while I was reading, I couldn't also help but think about like what cinema, generally speaking, and I hear what I mean in terms of like the emergence of, let's say, of a certain kind of like Hollywood cinema in the late 70s and how that would kind of really overtake so many kind of conceptions of what it meant to kind of go to the movies and consume movies and films. And thinking about that sea change just two decades later in relationship to what he's writing here, I just kept thinking about how far the goalposts were moved and how different, let's say, conceptions of white elephant art versus termite art are contemporary in terms of contemporary terms. But then also thinking about the ways in which the binary doesn't quite hold. And one interesting thing in some of Shaun's notes, and again, we can discuss these in some detail, is the way in which a lot of these films and a lot of these filmmakers and a lot of these artists have both elements at play within the same, aesthetic object, let's say. So that, say in something like Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, there are like these termite elements to it, but then in so many other ways, there are much larger, grander gestures towards a certain kind of white elephant mastery that I think can't be denied.
Yeah, for sure. I definitely think it's all exists on this spectrum, and especially this, coming up with the termite art now. Actually, when I was thinking about these concepts, I was thinking of the idea of like A movies versus B movies. And then I was trying to think like, what are the B movies now too? Like, do B movies exist?
I think they do. I think if you, and it might be a little different because I think the entire culture has shifted towards this like very self-referential kind of thing. Of like, everything, especially prestige TV, is self-referential. But when I think about B movies, like what I want from a B movie now is I feel like the best B movies, or a clear example of B movies, is going on Netflix and finding action movies starring like Bob Odenkirk made an action movie for Netflix recently. These like lo-fi dad trying to save his daughter, like. But
that's so ironic, where it's like, B movies. I guess that's the thing. We're just too steeped in irony. We're like, I don't know. There's no concept of B because B is A and A is B.
Do you feel like irony has something to play in the sort of the difference between a termite film or a termite art versus white elephant art? Because I feel like the entire culture has this. I think The Joker has a lot of irony going, and I would say that's a pretty white elephant movie.
For sure. Yeah. I mean, I think that really speaks to a lot because it goes back to this idea of like self-awareness, right? So to be ironic, you need to be self-aware. And if Antonioni is looking at the frame and is arranging it so perfectly, it's because he has a self-awareness outside of himself of what that frame is going to fit like within the movie and how he'll look like a genius, or whatever, Farber's words, in that moment. So I feel like almost by saying like stating this preference for termite art, it's this art where it's like so insular and just focused on what the material is. It's not concerned with anything else or how it looks. Whereas irony and self-awareness there's always going to be that level of concern with how it looks, or at least you being aware of your awareness.
Have you guys seen, we talked about this recently, and I thought it was an interesting example of a white elephant art film, and then we can move on to talk about Batman. But I recently rewatched Most Violent Year. Mm-hmm. The, what's the J.C. Chandor, Oscar Isaac film, and it's a really, really good film, and I think that I think it's a really great film, but I think that it has a white elephant quality in the main performance. I feel like Oscar Isaac is calling back to Pacino in Godfather, and this kind of like feeling of honor and having to appear honorable despite the things that the problems within his business, the organized crime, the things that he's doing. And I feel like in that case, it's very effective because he's playing on our cultural knowledge of a character, and he's using that as a way to instantly have us form sympathy with this character, because we go like, oh, it's like Al Pacino in The Godfather. I care about Al Pacino in The Godfather. We might not make that connection intellectually, but by referencing someone else, he's creating a more interesting character, if that makes sense.
Or I guess there's like a shorthand that then is created, which then I feel like Farber would be like, but then you're not really digging into the material, you're like relying on like the audience seeing this character and like recognizing this other character, as opposed to just like really creating something that's like there in the material.
So then are all Marvel movies white elephant movies?
Oh, totally.
Yeah, I think so too.
In different degrees, yeah.
Right.
But see, that's what's really interesting about them, right? Because then all of a sudden, like questions of production values and of kind of like literally just like economic questions regarding budgets come into play to think about, let's say, the amount of money that's invested in these products that are both utterly sheer like spectacles, but also pure shit, like devoid of any sort of real value. Yeah. Or let's say attempt to actually say something, which makes them termite-y perhaps.
Yeah,
because there's no fucking thesis statements other than the fact that their own existence is kind of what perpetuates them and keeps them going.
And they're not aesthetically pretty movies. They're like purely functional in its filmmaking. So I don't know. Maybe that is the termite art then, right?
Well, aren't they beautiful though? I mean, there's some moments though of like the spectacle. I mean, not that I'm saying that there's. They're not beautiful.
When you blow Marvel movies, when you just blow them.
If only I could, I would. I'd marry them if I could.
I think some of them. I think Thor Ragnarok is a good-looking movie.
Yeah, I mean, all movies of that budget or anything and that level of professionalism is always going to look good. But like when you think of certain moments and like, you watch the Nolan movies, right? And they have these visual moments that just like stay in your brain where it's just like, oh, well, this is a movie that looks good, right? Like the Marvel movies look professional, but I don't know if they ever they look
more like TV.
Yeah. And it also feels like there's less directing in terms of like auteur cinema or whatever. Like you're not going to have like an Ari Aster sort of frame in there of like, look at this shot, look how fucking awesome this shot is, it's so significant.
Well, that's kind of what I think make the Russo brothers really good for Marvel films, because I don't think, and I don't mean this critically, I think we spend too much time talking about filmmaker styles, to be honest, in terms of like whether they're good or bad, but like those guys are really good at delivering a perfect style for those movies, and that they're not Ari Aster, or they're not trying to break the mold. But I do think that there are, and then we should talk about Batman, but the beginning of the first Infinity War movie, there's like a lot of handheld, kind of over the scene of all these people having been murdered on a spaceship, and like it sounds absurd, but that moment is really, really highly effective to me, because I think they just went like, let's just focus on all these things, and let's like shoot. Like you don't see a lot of handheld in Marvel movies, especially big special effects moments, and it's very effective to me. It gives it that feeling of being termite-y, and that it's on the ground and that it's happening in real time.
Yeah.
And I think that this speaks to the larger question of like, you can have, when we think about this kind of stuff, you can have a really powerful moment in an otherwise kind of generic by the numbers kind of film, and if you allow yourself to divorce your idea of what the whole product is, which I think is very termite-y, that you can have wonderful moments when you're not totally concerned with the entire package.
Totally. Yeah. Or like asserting like the Russo brothers don't try to say with their movies, like we're auteurs, you know what I mean? Like they're just trying to deliver a good movie, and it's functional and it works. And like, you're right. Like there are some moments in the Marvel movies that feel like really powerful moments, and not because of like this beautiful shot framing, it's coming from the material.
Well, and interestingly, they made a feature that was, speaking of Steven Soderbergh, that he, I believe, shepherded to the studio. And there's no filmmaker, I think, more concerned with process over product than Steven Soderbergh.
For sure.
He's made 14 movies since quarantine started, like with his Legos in his house, and they're all going to be on Netflix next week. But certainly kind of a different, kind of a more process-driven kind of approach. Let's talk about Batman. Let's talk about specifically the Batman films that we've already discussed. So we'll group roughly Burton, Schumacher, and Nolan into that category. You guys want to start with Burton?
Yeah.
Cool.
Yeah, George, you want to go for it?
Yeah. In terms of like where we list them, I mean, I was looking at Sean's list and not to kind of jump on his list.
Son of a bitch.
But
can't believe you.
But I do think, I mean, I mostly agree with what he was saying here. So Batman Returns, in terms of, are we ranking them, let's say, for most termite to less termite? Yeah, that there's certainly like a very kind of insular, let's say, obsession in these films. But again, this is like where the binary to me doesn't always kind of entirely hold, because there is like such a thumbprint on those films that is so like Burton-y, that you can't watch those films without in some sort of way thinking about them as Tim Burton films. But yes, I think Batman Returns is so much weirder and so much more eclectic than the original that one is in terms of those two. That one definitely is the one that is most termite.
Yeah.
So Sean's list goes from most termite to most white elephant. And, it's more complicated, but basically the way that he describes it is the Burtons are the most termite-y, followed by the Nolans. And
followed by
the
Schumachers.
Burton's, Schumachers, Nolans. So Sean, do you want to talk about why Tim Burton is the most quote unquote termite-y, recognizing that there is something of a continuum to this, or a non-binary?
I went into this thinking actually that Schumacher would be my most termite-y, and then I realized that camp isn't necessarily termite. I read the essay and I kind of broke down my thoughts on what does it mean to be termite and what does it mean to be white elephant, and then I made this spreadsheet because I fucking love spreadsheets of like all the Batman movies, and with these columns for like white elephant.
You didn't rewatch
termite.
all of them, did you?
No, I did not rewatch, but I was listening to the scores while doing my homework.
Nice.
And so yeah, with the Burton ones, what's interesting is like we do recognize like this Burton style, but it almost feels like he was this weird filmmaker that's always been doing that thing like since his shorts, and then he somehow was asked to direct this big movie, and he's just making a Burton movie with like Warner Brothers money, which is what I almost felt in like Batman Returns, especially Batman Returns, more than Batman. But the things that felt termite to me in the Burton movies are particularly the performances and his casting of these actors that sometimes feel like they're working outside of the material as opposed to within the material. And then like within these scenes, really like eating up the material and like moving these characters forward in really interesting, unique ways, versus like the kind of more hamminess that we'd see in like the Schumacher ones. Like these are over the top too, but in their own way. And I think of like Michael Keaton when he's playing the public facing Bruce Wayne, like when he's at the party and when he's having the date with Vicky Vale, and Michael Keaton's doing so many interesting, fascinating things that like, it's not a functional directory thing of saying, all right, Michael Keaton, I need you to like position your face 3/4 and look at your key light over there because this shot's going to be amazing. It feels like, like this scene is about Bruce Wayne being a fucking weirdo, and Michael Keaton, you're just doing your thing right now and showing me that Bruce Wayne is a weirdo. It's really great. So inspired. And like, you could see Michael Keaton just like really chewing through the material. And with Batman Returns, he really commits more to these weirdness. So it's like these scenes that are like, what is this scene about? Where does it fit? I don't know, but it's Selena Kyle fucking having this ball in like what's it called? Like a clothing department store, and like destroying her apartment. And those scenes just on their own go on way too long in a way that's like really cool. And with his aesthetics, it's interesting because his production design is very Burton-esque. I think that's more of what we think about when we think of the Burton look, is like costumes, sets, things like that. but his directing is actually just very functional. Like watching scenes of the movie on YouTube, just to like remind myself some of the visuals. It's just like kind of very standard sort of directing. So it almost feels like he is just figuring out what is the best place to capture the action. So yeah, so I've labeled him a goth termite.
I love it.
Yeah, he's our goth termite.
That's a good one. Well, let's talk about your neon elephant, which I think was the name of my second album, Joel Schumacher. To me, this initially felt like the most white elephant-y, but I think, like I said, he felt the most campy to me.
Wait, did the Schumacher felt the most white elephant or the most termite-y?
To me, white elephant, but I have to say that was before I spent more time thinking about this. Like, I think that it's very easy to without a lot of reflection, assume that has something that white elephant refers to the amount of production, which I think it does, but like it's more complicated than that. So Schumacher was an interesting one for me to think about, and I think that the Schumacher and Shaun, I'd love to hear. Well, Shaun and George, I'd love to hear both your thoughts, but I feel like the Schumacher is more concerned actually with the Batman mythos than Burton's version of it, in the sense that like there's a lot of callbacks to young Batman, especially in Batman and Robin when he's talking about Alfred, and they both attempt to add to Batman's trauma, which I feel like is a call to continuity a little bit. And he's very concerned with Kilmer and Clooney having the quote unquote right kind of quality, the right kind of tragedy. Whereas with Keaton, I feel like you said, Burton was like, you're kind of weird. You're a stand-up comedian who's become an actor. You just played Beetlejuice. Why can't you be a suave billion? It's more self-referential to Batman as a character.
But there's also such a commitment though to the narrowness of a certain kind of vision of that character. In those Schumacher films, that the narrowness of it doesn't appear in Burton's version or Nolan's version, which to me also perhaps furthers the argument that those are the most termite-y. Like that there's a commitment to the absurd, campy comic book Batman that is to some degree, I think, really alienating to people who expect a certain kind of version of Batman that might be more, let's say, universally acceptable in certain sort of ways. So also like I think like the queerness of like Schumacher's version also of the character I think applies there. It's like, what's going on? But
he's not queer.
But there's something in that version of the character that to me also makes it like potentially more termite-y than Burton. But either way, I think we're all on the same page that on that spectrum of termite-y to white elephant, Nolan is very much on the side of white elephant. And the other two are on the other side.
Let me ask you this then, because I was thinking about this while you were talking a little bit. To me, one of the things that we've talked a little bit about is that Christopher Nolan, to me, and it's a specific type, but all of his movies are concerned, I think, with like male anxiety. I think he's really, really like a guy who's made a lot of blockbusters, but they're all about his fear and the things that he's scared of. And I feel like he uses Batman as a way to explore that stuff. So the fear of losing the parents, the fear of kind of like the inverse of yourself, and then the fear of losing control in The Dark Knight Rises. I feel like these are all very Nolan-esque touches. So is that he's exploring his own kind of particular neurosis more than he's exploring the mythos of Batman, make him more or less white elephant-y? Because I feel like he's more concerned with his own interests more than he is with representing Batman in the quote-unquote comic booky way. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Well, it does. But I mean, I think then you get, I think, into kind of, let's say, director or artist psychology in the sense that you can make an argument that every single aesthetic object directly relates back to the artist's psychology and not, let's say, acknowledge the fact that like those Batman films in particular are constructed in such a way that they're meant to be prestigious and they're meant to be, let's say, serious film, serious cinema in a way that the other ones are not.
Right, for sure. Yeah, and really in thinking of since it sounds like, so we're transitioning to Nolan now, right?
Yeah.
Okay. Just to sort of thinking of Schumacher as like the weirdly bridging point, right? So like, Liam started thinking, all right, maybe that's the most white elephant-y of them all, right? George, you're more on the like it's the closer to Termite side. This one was real tough for me because I really thought going into it like, oh yeah, that's the Termite, right?
You mean Nolan?
The Schumacher,
I see.
right? And then thinking of some of those scenes. There's the camp there, but then I was thinking about how there's self-aware camp, and then there's just camp that's just truly camp. And
that's good.
Then I asked myself, because Farber talks about this idea of burrowing, right? So I just kept going back to some of the words he was using over and over again, like burrow and inertia. And so I was thinking of like, do any of the scenes in Batman and Robin really burrow? And I think in Batman and Robin, for sure, there's some scenes that like really burrow. I don't know if the actors particularly do. Sometimes they feel like they're just mugging for the camera. But
yeah.
I was really torn on this because there are certain Termite qualities, but I kind of had this in the middle for that. Now, getting to Nolan, what's really interesting is he's actually unfussy about technique. When we're thinking about just pure aesthetic technique, like he's very much like a functional sort of director that is very actor focused. His stuff is usually just like covering the scene in handheld and like a master and then like 2 singles, right? And then cutting it together in the editing room. He's actor focused. They just do a couple of these takes. It's kind of handheld. It's got this very loose sort of unfussy style. But then I thought of what all this is in service of. And even though it's actor focused and he's got these amazing actors that could really dig deep into this material, everything in the movies, as much as I love all 3 of them, is purely functional. Every single scene just exists to go to the next scene and then to go to the next scene. And everything is a plant. Everything is a plant. And no scene or moment really gets a chance to just like exist on its own, because his movies are so stuffed with content that it just like when I was rewatching The Dark Knight a few weeks ago, that's what struck me this time. I was like, oh my God, like this movie has so much stuff in it. And it's just going like that, like really, really fast. And so in the one Farber thing that he was saying was this adherence to continuity, right? Like nothing can just exist on its own. And in this one is very much this Rube Goldberg, one thing has to lead to the next and purely exists to lead to the next. So, white elephant for me.
I want to offer like one quick caveat, I think, to 2 Termite moments in The Dark Knight, and I'd be curious, or maybe 2.5. One is the interrogation scene, because I think the entire movie gives over to that, and it really that scene becomes a thing unto itself that I feel like transcends even I think that movie's creaky. Like you really feel the movement happening, and that moment really, really pulls you. You're kind of snapped out of the flow of it by how, I think, quite frankly, disturbing that scene is. But the other thing that I think about is towards the end, and when the camera turns upside down and the Joker is upside up but upside down. I feel like that moment really kind of like, I don't know if it's white elephant art or Termite art, but it exists as such an unusual stylistic choice within that film that it really feels like something else. Those feel like transcendent moments that transcend the kind of functionality of the rest of the film.
And I guess that's the interesting thing about thinking of the distinction between the two, because Termite art can also transcend. So it's a question like talking of that camera movement. It goes back to sort of what George was saying of artist psychology and trying to figure that out and artist intent. Because it's like, is that moment his show offy, like, look at my fucking dick, I get art, and like, that is it that moment? Or is it really just like, I'm so committed to this one moment and this is the only way to go further with it?
Yeah. Well, another interesting thing scene to think about is the opening heist, which is so directly referential to Heat, but that sequence doesn't need to be in the movie. So in a way, it's very Termite-y in that it is it's an opening digress. It sets up the world, but we don't need that scene to understand the movie. I think that scene is a little bit of showboating, but it's also like an incredible short film within a and it starts kind of before the movie starts. So I think that's interesting.
That's where I think it's also very much a question of mastery, going to this idea of, like we said, it's showboating. Like, yeah, totally. Like white elephant art, to me, at least as Farber was talking about it, one way to think about it is think about it like as mastery and as control. And to also then think about how this essay is making an argument for like auteur theory in a certain way. So one of the interesting things about the essay also, and it's come up here in discussion, is to think about, let's say, like, again, all of these different kind of elements that go into making a film. And obviously, like, that you need so many different people and so many different things on the same page to fucking make just a simple film. So to think about, for example, like how one can perhaps have like a white elephant film and yet, however, have, let's say, a performance in it that is in some sort of way termite-y, so that it runs against the grain, let's say, of the overall feel of the entire project, which again is just something that I haven't really thought a lot about, but to think about again, like, what is this essay saying again about like notions of auteur theory, of kind of mastery, of artistic control. I mean, one thing for example, we haven't talked about is the fact that Farber is primarily a painter, and that the essay also begins with him talking about painting in contrast to film, which I think is also like a very interesting historical context to, again, at least consider. But even if, you know, like, I don't really have anything fucking concrete to say about that right now, but
I feel like the big thing that we've illuminated, I think that it's very simple to, in not simple, but in Farber's case, he views white elephant art mostly in a negative sense.
Yes, totally.
And termite art is quite positive. But I think that it's very fair to say that, like, there are movies that are quote unquote white elephant that we love. I mean, I think like Denis Villeneuve is a great filmmaker, and he's made some very, very, very white elephant-y movies. But he also made Enemy, which is very termite-y to me. So it's like, there are really, you know, the best kind of movies can exist in both worlds.
Yes.
I feel like the problem that maybe we all have with prestige television, you know, I didn't watch it. I'm sure the Watchmen show is good, but how heavily these shows feel like they have to lean on an existing continuity, I think is exhausting people, which is why a film like Uncut Gems is so successful, or films of that ilk, or Parasite, because these are movies that are not adhering to a continuity or a previously established kind of character. They're just, I mean, I feel like those are two pretty termite-y movies, and maybe the question of termite versus white elephant is our own cultural reference to things in terms of how we think about them.
Yeah,
so
for sure.
I feel like there's a continuity, and that you can have, you know, these definitions, or these sort of categories do not define a film's quality or if we like it or not.
Sure.
Correct. Yeah.
Totally.
Correct. God damn it. Correct.
Yeah. I mean, it really is just, it's a spectrum, right? And I think with Farber's definition, most of the films that we tend to love are white elephant films. You know, everything we've been taught if we've gone to film school, and what to look for and what is considered like good art is tends to be the white elephant art. It's not just the Eddie Redmayne lame Oscar bait shit, but it's all the stuff that, like, you know, The Godfather, I'm sure Farber would consider to be white elephant art, right? All these things that are like sort of sacred cows to us might be considered that. But we don't need to necessarily adopt that binary thinking, right? Like, we could, or even say, give any kind of association to one being good and one being bad. It's more just like termite is sort of this and has this quality to it. So that to me feels like some of the character actors in Uncut Gems. And then white elephant films have sort of this quality to it. So yeah, maybe that is Midsummer, but you know, I don't totally love that movie, but there's some parts to it that are really fucking awesome. Maybe Wes Anderson is like white elephant art. I love Wes Anderson movies, right? So I think it's less about, the judgment and really just trying to think of his arguments in terms of what are those qualities and what do they sort of mean.
So we've talked about also, if anybody can think about it off the top of their heads, we've talked about white elephant art that is shit, like the Marvel movies perhaps. But are there termite movies that are also shitty?
I'm sure, and we just don't know them because we don't even watch them. You know, it's like that fucking U-Bowl guy from Germany or whatever, right? It's like these.
Well, I think that there's one more interesting thing to think about, which is and Shaun, a movie that you and I've talked about a lot, is the Apu trilogy, and how I feel like in a weird way, those films have kind of transitioned from being termite to white elephant in the culture, because this was a guy making movies with no money.
Mm-hmm.
There's so much of what's great about them is what happened in the moment as they were happening, and they're kind of, what's the term for a coming of age film? They have that kind of quality of being like sort of, they've become canon.
Mm-hmm.
And I feel like there's a way that you could be like, oh yeah, they're so like, you know, kind of, they're white elephanty in the fact that like they're self-referential or all these things, but really like it's the culture that defines these things, not the filmmakers making the movies.
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah.
so it's an interesting question.
Yeah. Or is that white elephant because he was striving to make art and make an artistic statement, and all the Bollywood stuff that was just being made for entertainment that people really, really spoke to them? Is that the termite? I don't know, but I guess he's got us thinking about these things and like trying to understand what these qualities are and what to look for.
Yeah.
So thank you, Manny.
Thank you, Manny.
R.I.P.
Pour one out for Manny. Pour some of your evil twin ale out for Manny. All right, guys, this was very good. Thank you so much. I'm Liam Billingham.
I'm George Fragopoulos.
Shaun.
And I'm Shaun Seneviratne.
Oh, wait, Shaun, just very briefly, is there anything you want to plug?
Anything I want to plug? No, not at the moment. I'm just busy trucking away. I've written some things and I'm busy teaching. And, you could follow me on Instagram. There's some funny, dumb content on there that I've been posting, stuff about my record collection and stuff about movies I've been watching. So I am the Brown Shaun, SHAUN, at the Brown Shaun, on Instagram and any other social media. So, yeah.
Awesome. This was Oeuvre Buster.
Oeuvre Busters.
Everybody.
Thanks.
Oeuvre Busters? Oeuvre Busters.
Oeuvre Buster.
Oeuvre. Sometimes I have to spell check Oeuvre when I have to type it in.
Oh,
we still don't have to spell
spelled in like all of our documents.
Yeah.
All of our documents have different spellings.
We are totally
I'm gonna cut.
All right.